Welcome back to our podcast, Pursuing Justice. I had mentioned that we had changed our name because we discovered there's another podcast that's Pursuit of Justice. So now we are just Pursuing Justice. I am Harriet Hendel. Our series this time has been focused on a case of wrongful conviction, which took place back in 1976 in Jacksonville, Florida. Two men were involved, an uncle and his nephew, Clifford Williams Jr., and his nephew, Hubert Nathan Myers. These two men were incarcerated for 43 years for a crime they did not commit. Two key players, the new Conviction Integrity Unit based in Jacksonville and the Innocence Project of Florida based in Tallahassee, worked together to prove their innocence. In March of 2019, the men were exonerated. Just a little note here, I am on the board of directors of the Innocence Project of Florida. Today, I will be speaking to Krista Dolan, one of two lawyers at the Innocence Project of Florida who represented Nathan Myers. Welcome, Krista. It's good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Harriet. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Can you tell us how you came to work at the Innocence Project of Florida?
Sure. Actually, I took a post-conviction remedies class in law school with Seth, the executive director, and the other attorney here. The first year he taught it while I was in law school. And that kind of gave me the exposure to post-conviction work, which I then did in Kentucky for almost 6 years. And I was looking to move back to Florida. My family is here and I wanted to return. And it just kind of was fortuitous that at the same time I was coming back, the longtime attorney who had been working here, Melissa Montel, she was leaving. And Seth, knew I had the post-conviction experience and the exposure and reached out and, talked about interviewing me and, it all unfolded from there.
All right. Why did you choose this line of work as opposed to another area of the law?
I really enjoy post-conviction work. I think it's a better opportunity to look at some of the systemic problems in the system. I think it's kind of the best of both worlds. You get to have individual client work and, work with individuals and get to know them and their stories. But the cases you work on have the capacity for larger scale change, which is something that really appeals to me. And that's what got me interested in post-conviction work and innocence work in particular.
Thank you. What do you find is most challenging about your job?
That's a tough one. Many challenges on a daily basis, but I think, probably one of the most frustrating things is, procedural hurdles in our court system. Once an individual has been convicted, no matter how strong the evidence may be of innocence, the procedures in place to kind of keep the conviction standing are difficult to fight against. And so I find that to be one of the most challenging aspects of the job when, you have a very strong case and strong evidence of innocence that, you think may be a slam dunk and you're met with resistance in the courts or by the state. And, that's frustrating.
You have to be patient. I so often hear our executive director, Seth Miller, who you mentioned, speak at board meetings about the challenges that face him. And I hear him talk about going back into court. So you have to be very patient and understand how the system works and work within it. What I wanted to ask you next was if you'd share with us your role of representing Mr. Myers and how you worked with the Conviction Integrity Unit to prove Mr. Myers' innocence.
Sure. So I was lucky enough to get to work on Mr. Myers' case and be a part of, this new these developing relationships with conviction integrity units around the state. And Shelley had actually reached out to Seth, and obviously being a staff attorney here, I became involved as well. And our role was really that, the state attorney's office had done all this really great work on really digging to uncover all this evidence of innocence for Mr. Myers, and had decided they wanted to grant relief, but needed a mechanism to do so. In Florida, it's not very common. The state isn't typically like the moving party to vacate a conviction. And being the Innocence Project of Florida and being post-conviction attorneys, that's our area of expertise. And so, she immediately thought of us, and, we spent some time, Seth and I, brainstorming what we thought would be the mechanism to file a motion to vacate his conviction, and created that motion and drafted that, and, reviewed the whole case, and of course met with Mr. Myers and, represented him on that motion.
I see. Did you feel confident at the outset in taking on this case of wrongful conviction? I guess in essence, you didn't take it on. That was probably more the domain of the Conviction Integrity Review Unit. But did you feel confident in any case stepping into this case of wrongful conviction?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is, what we do on a day-to-day basis. We're quite comfortable taking large volumes of material and working through it quickly. And, that was the challenge with this case, is that, the Conviction Integrity Unit had already been working on it for some time, and, they wanted to get things done quickly. And so we were, kind of turned our attention full time to digging into this case and getting this motion written for him.
I see. So often when I speak about the Innocence Project of Florida, which I do all winter in Sarasota, people ask me, well, how does the project know which cases to take? Because I know you get over 1,000 letters per year asking for help, and you certainly cannot take all those cases. How do you determine? And when people ask me that, I don't have an answer. How do you determine, out of all the letters that come in, which case to take and which not? And if say Mr. Myers had written to you, and there were no Conviction Integrity Unit, how would you have felt about taking this case? Would you have had any doubts?
So, there's a difference between doubts about their claims and then having, or let me say, there's a difference between having confidence in their claims or thinking there's good claims of innocence and having a way to pursue those claims. So, I mean, without the Conviction Integrity Unit, which is part of the reason they started to form, Mr. Myers had already been, essentially procedurally barred in the courts. He'd already gone through all of his remedies, which, going back to your earlier question about frustrations, that is a point of frustration. We have many cases come through, and you can, see a claim that might otherwise be, very good claim of innocence, but if, they don't meet all these certain procedural requirements to go into court, we can only take cases where we can prove their claims of innocence and where we have a remedy available to them. If there isn't a remedy, we can't take the case. So that's kind of a big screening point, is, whether we have an ability to litigate it in court. And, it's a case like Mr. Myers, we wouldn't have had the ability to litigate it in court. It was really the Conviction Integrity Unit's involvement that made this exoneration possible, which is why they're so important and why there's more and more forming throughout the state. It's, an avenue where, they've already been failed in the courts, and, this gives them another chance to have this evidence heard.
Now, I've read a lot about the case. Nicholas Kristof wrote a very strong piece about it in the New York Times. You talk about the fact that he had kind of been down the road trying to appeal his case, and I read that those appeals failed. Why did that happen? And then the Conviction Integrity Unit steps in, and you step in, and the case is won. What happened along the way that his attempts to gain his freedom failed?
Oh, that's such a complicated question, and I wish there were a really straightforward answer.
Sorry about that.
There's so many reasons. One of the big reasons is, prisoners don't have access to the same resources. They are inside. So if they're saying, so-and-so is going to say this about my case, they don't have the ability to go track that person down and interview them and talk to them, that we as attorneys or investigators have that ability to do. That's a part of it. Another part is that they're writing all these motions pro se. They're not necessarily articulating their claims and the way that they need to be written so that the court will understand what they're asking for and understand what they're saying. There's many reasons. I can't say for sure. Sometimes the courts don't always give reasons or explanations. I can't say for sure why they weren't unsuccessful before, but I can say that, the likelihood of success is much, much higher when the state is on board and when, they agree there's been an injustice. And that's really what gave us the ability here to work on this case. That was kind of the basis for our motion, was newly discovered evidence. And, a part of that was that the state had a change in their position. They no longer thought the case was, worthy of prosecution. And so that was kind of, a fundamental change in position, which we thought warranted relief.
I see. Were there barriers for your role along the way? I would think maybe that might be a question to ask the director of the Conviction Integrity Unit. But were there any barriers along the way for you or for the Innocence Project of Florida?
Not in a sense of, what we might normally be used to. We already had the state in agreement, which is, something that isn't that common. And, that was something that was really helpful to us. But I think, the only real barriers were that it was so new and kind of just navigating the system of how we go about this.
I see. When you take on a case like this, are you working on this one exclusively, or are you juggling other cases simultaneously?
So for this one, we, really turned most of our attention to this because we were trying to meet, a deadline that we wanted to get to court. But typically, we're juggling. We're always juggling multiple cases, and some get, a little more attention if they have a deadline coming up, and others. So, we're always kind of juggling, but some take priority at certain times, depending on, what's going on in their case.
Knowing is this correct? There are only 2 lawyers. You mentioned there was another attorney on staff. Aren't there only 2 lawyers, Krista, on staff?
Yes, it's two lawyers, but Seth also serves as executive director, so I'm the only one who's full-time devoted to litigation.
I see. How many cases does the Innocence Project of Florida take on and litigate at the same time? How many cases are being worked on?
Right now we have 30 open cases.
Oh my.
So, but not all of them, some of them are waiting for orders. Some of them are, they're just pending. So, but there's 30 that are active that are currently in some form of litigation.
That's quite a bit. And of course, the time each one takes, some take years, and some much shorter than others. It's truly, truly a juggling act. How does the Innocence Project of Florida help a man like Nate